I'm setting my clock for 15 minutes and 15 seconds so that I can be gonged by Professor Lang. I promised to do that at exactly 15 minutes. All right, so I'm going to talk to you about an ethical topic. I'm going to talk about ethical relativism and ethical objectivity. And what I want to do is I want to first explain what I mean by ethical relativism, and then tell you why you shouldn't believe it, even though most of you do, I bet. So, here's what I mean by ethical relativism. It's the view that morality and ethics, I use these terms interchangeably right now, morality and ethics are relative to culture. And what I mean by that is just the following, namely, that if you think about what the ultimate moral standards are, and we probably disagree about what they are, what ethical relativism says is that they are different from culture to culture, or society to society. The idea is that ethics is basically like the law, or like etiquette, wherein there's no universal, objective standard of correctness for what's morally right and what's morally wrong, but rather, what's right and wrong depend on the prevailing standards within a given society or a given culture. And there's no sort of umbrella, overarching, universally correct moral standard by which to judge the rightness or correctness of each individual society's or culture's moral code. So, just as there's no universal legal system or no universal set of what's polite and what's impolite, but they rightly differ from society to society, the same is true with ethics. How many of you, just a quick show of hands, how many of you are attracted to this idea that ethics is relative in the way I've just described? Good. There's one person who's proud about it, and then there are a few, I guess I tipped my hand a little too early. Okay. All right. So, what I want to do is I want to trot through three arguments that I've often heard that have convinced a lot of folks to be sympathetic to the relativist point of view. And I want to show why those arguments might not be as good as some of you, at least, initially think they are. And then if I've got time, and even if I don't, I'll try to throw in a few problematic implications of the relativist view. But that's not my primary concern here. My primary concern is to try out some arguments that you might have heard, you might have given yourself, that you found persuasive, and show you why they might not be so persuasive. So here's the first argument for ethical relativism. And that's an argument that involves God. And here's the thought. I guess I should define one more term before I give you the argument. The term is objectivity, and in particular, ethical objectivity. What ethical objectivity is, the term objectivity has a dozen different senses, but what I mean by ethical objectivity is this, that there's a standard of ethics, a standard of what's right and wrong, or ethically good and bad, and that standard is correct no matter what anyone, anywhere thinks of it. No matter how many people endorse it, human opinion is not authoritative here. So, think, just by way of a comparison, think about the laws of, I was going to say logic until I had my mind blown 10 minutes ago, so I'm in a little bit of a liability here. I should have gone second, but okay. So think maybe about the laws of logic or the laws of physics if you want, or the laws of geology, the basic principles of geology or chemistry. These are correct not because we think they're correct. We've invented the vocabulary, we've invented names to describe the facts or the principles or the truths in chemistry or logic, but they are true not because we think they're true. We think they're true, if we do, because they're true. That's the kind of objectivity I've got in mind. So, here are three arguments against the idea that ethics is objective. The first one invokes God, and here's the thought. The only way morality or ethics could be objective is if God wrote the law, so to speak, if God made up the ethical code of what's right and wrong. But here comes the second thought. There is no God. God doesn't exist. And therefore, the only possible basis for the objectivity of ethics is undercut. So ethics couldn't possibly be objective. The only way it could be is if God laid down the law. Okay. Now, let's call this the argument from atheism, because atheism is the view that there is no God. If you're not an atheist, then you're not going to find this argument very persuasive, or you might be up in the air about it. If you're a theist in particular, someone who believes in the existence of God, then you're not going to find this argument appealing at all, because it just assumes that there's no God, and you reject that. Now, if I had another 15 minutes, we could solve the problem about whether God exists. But I only got 15 minutes. You can only ask so much of me. So we'll just set that aside. Fine. So what I want to do is say, look, if you're a theist, then we can just move on, right? But for those of you who are skeptical, you're unsure, you're an agnostic, you're not sure whether there's a God or whether there isn't, or you're a theist, you believe in God, then then this argument is a non-starter for you. So let me just talk to the atheists out there for a little bit before I move on to the next argument. If this argument's named for you after, I called it the argument from atheism, so you should really like it, right? No, you shouldn't like it. Why? Because although it expresses a commitment to atheism in the argument, there's an additional assumption, philosophers call an additional premise in this argument, and it goes like this. The only way ethics can be objective is if God wrote the ethical law, laid down the moral code. And what I want to do is I want to challenge you to think about that twice. Because as an atheist, I bet you do believe that there are other objective truths out there that are not underwritten by God. So think about the laws of physics, for instance. I don't know what the laws of physics are. Mark does. I don't. Okay? There are a lot of things I don't know. One of them is the laws of physics. And I flunked chemistry. I don't know the laws of chemistry either. But so for those atheists out there, what I invite you to think about this. Namely, don't you believe that the laws of physics or the laws of chemistry are objective? You didn't make them up, did you? And the folks in the physics department and chemistry department didn't make them up. They discovered them. Now, it might be the case that we don't have the final perfected versions of those laws. I think anyone in the physics and chemistry department would allow for that, for the fallibility of their investigations. But what we can say is this: whatever those laws are, even if we haven't yet discovered them, they are what they are. They are correct, not because we human beings believe that they're correct. If we're lucky enough to get it right, what we've done is we've latched on to a truth not of our own making, or a set of truths not of our own making. In other words, what we've got is a set of objective truths that don't require, since I'm talking to the atheists among you, that don't require God's having authored those truths. So what we've got now is, we've got a whole body of truths that are objective, but are not divinely authored. And so I want to ask you, and maybe we can pursue this over some dessert or something like that afterwards, I want to ask you, why would ethical laws, in order to be objective, need to be underwritten by God when no other laws whose objectivity we're taking for granted don't need divine authorship? So what's so special about ethical laws that require divine authorship, objective ethical laws, that all the other objective laws that you probably already acknowledge don't require divine authorship? So that's a lot of time taken. So let me go through in less than 7 minutes, but more than 6 minutes and 28 seconds, 2 other arguments. The next argument is an argument from disagreement. Here's what I hear a lot. I hear this argument a lot. In ethics, as opposed to science, there's so much more disagreement. There's disagreement about what's correct, and there's also disagreement about method, about how to find out what's right and wrong. There is this thing called the scientific method. Next year, when Professor Lang gives one of these 15-minute talks about scientific method, he'll tell you there is no such thing as the scientific method. But let's assume for right now there is such a thing. Nevertheless, when we contrast that method with what goes on in ethics, what Professor Lesher said and what Professor Russell said also goes in ethics. Namely, we're talking about a lot of the same problems for 2,500 years, and they don't seem to be resolved in ethics. We're still talking about a whole bunch of the same issues. But in science, what we seem to see is a steady progress towards consensus. And that gives us reason to think that in science we're getting to the objective truth because all these smart folks are agreeing about it. But in ethics, we're still hammering away at the same old problem. So what that seems to indicate is that ethics is at bottom just a matter of taste. There's nothing objective about it. It's just each person or each society's own distinctive take on it with no objective standard of correctness. Okay. So I want to cast doubt on this line of thinking, which we can summarize in the following way, by means of the following argument. Let's call it the argument from disagreement. And what that says is that if you got really smart, open-minded, reasonable, rational folks who persistently disagree about some question, some subject matter, some topic, then there's no objective truth about that. And guess what? In ethics, you got smart folks on both sides of the aisle. With regard to any ethical claim, whatever, you can point to someone who seems to be rational, open-minded, smart, well-intentioned, who disagrees with someone else who meets that description. And so, in ethics, there aren't any objective truths. If there were, we'd see a lot more convergence and consensus than we do. But as a matter of fact, what we see is persistent disagreement. What I want to say here quickly is just a couple things. One is that you might push back. I don't want to do this. You might push back and say, you know what, as a matter of fact, there's way more agreement than you think in ethics. Now, I actually am a little sympathetic to this. What gets top billing all the time, what grabs the headlines, are those issues like abortion, about which there is persistent disagreement. But if you think about it, there is so much that we just take for granted about what's right and wrong. If someone came in with a chainsaw and said, Russ, it's time for me to just chainsaw your legs off, and I say, I was hoping this moment wouldn't come tonight, and I say, why? And he says, well, just because I don't like the shirt you're wearing. That's not a problem, is it? Morally speaking? And I say, we all say, yeah, of course it's a problem. And guess what? It's not just that we in this room would say it, it's that we in any room, folks in any room across the world would say it. It's not just some parochial Western ideology here that's going on. This is very close to, if not a universal ethical truth that would be agreed on. You shouldn't chainsaw people's legs out from under them just for fun. Okay, and there are tons of claims like that that we all take for granted, but never get discussed because they are the object of a background agreement. So we could push back that way, but what I want to do instead is focus on this question. Namely, is persistent disagreement among really smart people really evidence that there is no objective truth of the matter? And what I want to say is, no, it's not. And let me talk about God. Indulge me, let me talk about God, since I'm in a pulpit, sort of, just for a little bit, and ask you this. Isn't there an objective truth about whether God exists? That's a rhetorical question. The answer is yes. There is an objective answer to that question. There's an objective truth about whether I'm going to talk about God in terms of someone who's omniscient, creator of the world, omniscient, all-knowing, omnipotent, all-powerful, omnibenevolent, all-good, and the creator of the world. That's what I mean by God. I'm not saying whether there is such a being or not. What I'm saying is whether there is such a being doesn't depend on what I think about it. And it doesn't depend on what you think about it. It doesn't depend on what anyone thinks about it. There is that entity or there isn't. There's an objective truth about it. Has there been persistent disagreement among really smart folks over a long period of time about this? That's when you all answer in unison as a chorus. Yes, Russ, there is. Okay, I got 1 minute and 6 seconds to talk about dogmatism and tolerance. Many of you who are relativists because you think that's the only view that will support tolerance. You're wrong, he said dogmatically. If you believe, like I believe, that there is an objective morality out there somewhere, a lot of folks say, well, that's just dogmatic, Russ. That's, you shouldn't be in a position of forcing your views down other people's throats. And the answer, and what I say is, you're right, I shouldn't be. But if you think that there's an objective morality out there, the right attitude to take towards that is not being dogmatic, it's being humble. Just think about the other areas like physics and chemistry, where there are objective truths. The proper attitude for a physicist to take towards the physical world is not arrogance. Oh, there are objective truths out there. I know them all, therefore I get to shove them down your... No, that's not the way it is. It's a really complex world out there. And I, just a little old me, can't presume to know all those truths. Why? Because I don't get to make them up. And neither does my society. If my society had the final word on what's right and wrong, it would be super easy to know what's right and wrong. You just take a poll, right? Is that the way we really think we should solve ethical problems? No!